the street that everyone remembers, but no one can find. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort, feeling the softness beneath you, the gentle weight of blankets, the peace of this quiet moment. Tonight, we're walking together down a street that exists in memory but nowhere else, a place that hundreds of people swear they visited, yet no map has ever shown. Close your eyes and let your breathing slow, natural and easy, as we explore this mystery of collective memory and vanished geography. This is a place of cobblestones and lamplight, of shop windows and familiar corners, a street that lives vividly in the minds of those who remember it, despite all evidence suggesting it never existed at all. Welcome to Hushed History, where tonight we'll search for the street that everyone remembers, but no one can find. The phenomenon first came to widespread attention in 2003, though the individual experiences that comprise it stretch back decades, perhaps even a century or more. It began, as these things often do, with a casual conversation, a chance mention that triggered recognition and led to the realization that something strange was happening, that many people shared a memory of something that, according to all objective evidence, never existed. The conversation took place in a cafe in the English city of Middlesham, a mid-sized industrial city in the north of England with a history stretching back to medieval times, though most of its current architecture dates from the Victorian era and the 20th century. Two women, strangers to each other, happened to be seated at adjacent tables. One of them, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Fenton, was sketching in a notebook, drawing from memory the facade of a building she'd been thinking about all morning. The other woman, younger, perhaps in her 40s, glanced over and saw the sketch. "That's Hartley Street," she said with immediate certainty. "The bookshop with the green door." Margaret looked up, surprised and pleased. "Yes, exactly. You know it?" "Of course," the younger woman, whose name was Sarah Calloway, replied. "I used to go there as a teenager. They had the most amazing collection of old books, and the owner, what was his name? Mr. Pemberton? He'd let you sit and read for hours." Margaret nodded eagerly. "Mr. Pemberton, yes, with the glasses on the chain and that cardigan he always wore. And next door was the tea shop, the one with the little round tables and the lace curtains." "Mrs. Aldridge's place," Sarah confirmed. "She made those incredible scones with homemade jam." The two women spent the next 20 minutes excitedly sharing memories of Hartley Street. The particular slant of afternoon light on the cobblestones, the way sound seemed muffled and peaceful there, the smell of old paper from the bookshop mixing with the scent of baking from the tea room. They described the street lamp at the corner, ornate Victorian ironwork that always seemed to be lit even during the day, casting a warm glow. They remembered the small park at one end, with its iron fence and ancient oak tree. They recalled specific shops, a tobacconist, a watchmaker, a greengrocer with produce displayed on wooden crates outside. And then Sarah asked the obvious question, "I haven't been back in years. Is it still there? I'd love to visit again." Margaret's expression changed, confusion crossing her face. "Well, that's the thing. I've been trying to find it for months now. I have such clear memories of it from my childhood. I grew up in Middlesham, and Hartley Street was where my mother would take me shopping every Saturday. But I can't find it anymore. I've walked all over the city, looked at maps, even checked old city directories at the library. There's no Hartley Street, no record of one. It's like it never existed." Sarah stared at her. "That's impossible. I remember it so clearly. I can picture every detail. It was..." She paused, trying to orient the memory in physical space. "It was off the main high street. You walked through that little alley next to the old Woolworths building, and there it was." "That's exactly where I remember it," Margaret said. "But I've been through that alley a dozen times. It doesn't lead to any street. It just opens onto the back of the shopping center car park." The two women walked together from the cafe to the location they both remembered, the alley next to the old Woolworths building, which had long since been converted into a discount store. They walked through the alley, which was narrow and not particularly inviting, walled on both sides by brick buildings, and they emerged, as Margaret had described, into the concrete expanse of a car park, utilitarian and modern, showing no sign of ever having been anything else. Sarah stood there, bewildered. Her memory was so clear, so detailed. Hartley Street should be right here. She could almost see it, could almost feel the cobblestones under her feet, could almost hear the quiet sounds of the street. But there was nothing except cars and concrete and the modern architecture of the shopping center. "This isn't right," she said quietly. "This isn't what should be here." Margaret had experienced this disorientation before, but seeing someone else go through it was oddly validating. She wasn't alone in her memories. She wasn't misremembering or confusing Middlesham with some other city. Someone else, a complete stranger, remembered the exact same street in the exact same location, with the exact same details. They exchanged contact information and parted ways, but both were troubled. Over the following days, they independently conducted their own investigations. Sarah dug out old family photographs, looking for any that might show Hartley Street. She found none, though she had vivid memories of being there, of specific visits and events that should have been photographed. Margaret returned to the library and conducted more extensive searches through historical records, city planning documents, old maps. She found no mention of Hartley Street anywhere. But then Margaret had an idea. She posted a query on a local history website, asking if anyone remembered a street called Hartley Street in Middlesham, describing its location and some of its features. She expected perhaps a few responses, maybe confirmation that she was confusing Middlesham with another city, or that there had been a street by that name that was demolished decades ago. What she got was a flood of responses. Within a week, 47 people had replied, all saying yes, they remembered Hartley Street. They described it in vivid detail, and their descriptions matched Margaret's memories almost exactly. The cobblestone paving, which was distinctive, not the regular flat stones of most cobbled streets, but rounded stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of traffic. The gas lamps that lined the street, though some respondents remembered them as electric lamps designed to look like gas lamps. The particular collection of shops, with the bookshop and tea room mentioned by multiple people. The respondents ranged in age from their 30s to their 80s. Some remembered Hartley Street from childhood in the 1950s and 1960s. Others recalled visiting it in the 1980s and 1990s. A few claimed to have been there as recently as the early 2000s. The time span of these memories was itself odd. If the street had existed continuously from the 1950s through the 2000s, surely there would be abundant documentation, photographs, records. Yet there was none. Margaret organized a meeting for everyone who had responded to her post. 23 people attended, gathering in a community center on a rainy Tuesday evening in November 2003. They ranged in age, background, and life experience, but they all shared one thing: clear, detailed memories of Hartley Street. The meeting was emotional. People were relieved to discover they weren't alone in their memories, weren't going mad or experiencing some kind of neurological malfunction. But they were also disturbed by the impossibility of the situation. How could so many people remember something that apparently never existed? And their memories weren't vague or fuzzy. They were sharp, specific, filled with sensory details. A man named David Marsh, in his 70s, described visiting the watchmaker's shop on Hartley Street in 1957 to have his father's pocket watch repaired. He remembered the smell of oil and metal, the sound of dozens of clocks ticking in slightly different rhythms, the watchmaker's loop catching the light as he examined the watch's mechanism. He remembered the exact amount it cost to repair, 7 shillings and 6 pence, and remembered his mother's reaction when he brought the watch home fixed. The memory was as clear as any he possessed, clearer than many more recent events. A younger woman, Rebecca Torres, described getting lost on Hartley Street as a child in 1989. She'd been shopping with her mother and had wandered away, fascinated by the toys in a shop window. She remembered the panic of realizing she was alone, the strange quiet of the street making her isolation feel more complete, and then the kindness of a shop owner, the woman from the tea room, Mrs. Aldridge, who had taken her in and given her a biscuit and helped find her mother. Rebecca remembered the pattern on the biscuit tin, the feel of the shop owner's hand, warm and soft, holding hers. She remembered her mother's relief and anger when they were reunited. These weren't vague impressions or half-remembered dreams. These were detailed, emotionally resonant memories, the kind that form the texture of a person's life and identity. Yet they all referenced a place that, according to every map, Every city record, every photograph had never existed. The group decided to investigate systematically. They divided responsibilities. Some would search through city archives more thoroughly. Others would interview elderly residents who might remember the street or its demolition. Still others would try to find any photographic or documentary evidence. They called themselves, somewhat self-consciously, the Hartley Street Research Group, and they approached their task with the seriousness of academic researchers, though they had no institutional support or credentials. What they found, over the following months of investigation, only deepened the mystery. City planning records for Middlesham going back to 1847, when the first comprehensive survey was done, showed no street by the name of Hartley Street. The location where everyone remembered it, the area behind the old Woolworths building, had been, according to historical records, an open market area in the 19th century, then a series of workshops and small factories in the early 20th century, and finally had been redeveloped as part of the shopping center project in 1967. But here was something interesting. The 1967 redevelopment had been controversial. The research group found newspaper articles from that time documenting protests against the project, residents and shopkeepers arguing that the development would destroy the character of that part of the city. The articles mentioned specific shops and businesses that would be displaced, but none of these matched the shops that people remembered on Hartley Street. It was as if there were two parallel histories, the documented one and the remembered one, and they didn't align. Interviews with elderly residents produced mixed results. Some people, when asked about Hartley Street, looked puzzled and said they'd never heard of it. Others would get a distant look in their eyes and say, "Yes, I think I remember something like that," but couldn't provide details. And a few, perhaps 1 in 10 of those interviewed, would respond with immediate recognition and launch into detailed descriptions that matched the collective memory almost exactly. One of these was a woman named Elsie Drummond, 91 years old, living in a care home on the outskirts of Middlesham. When members of the research group visited her and asked about Hartley Street, her face lit up. "Oh, I haven't thought about Hartley Street in years," she said. "My father had a shop there, the tobacconist. I worked there as a girl before the war." She described the shop in extraordinary detail, the wooden counter worn smooth by decades of use, the glass jars of tobacco, the smell of pipe smoke and dried leaves, the regular customers who would come in daily for their cigarettes or tobacco. She remembered the shop's location on the street, next to the greengrocer, across from the bookshop. She remembered Mr. Pemberton at the bookshop, confirmed his appearance matched the descriptions others had given. She remembered Mrs. Aldridge at the tea room, remembered the taste of her scones. But when asked what had happened to the street, when it had been demolished or renamed, Elsie became confused. "I don't know," she said. "It just wasn't there anymore. I remember going to look for it once, years later, and not being able to find it. I thought perhaps I was misremembering where it had been. But I knew every street in central Middlesham. My whole life was lived within 10 streets of where I was born. I couldn't have been confused about the location." She was shown maps of Middlesham from various periods, 1920s, 1940s, 1960s. None showed Hartley Street. She looked at these maps with growing distress. "But it was there," she insisted. "I worked there for 3 years. I walked down that street 6 days a week. How can it not be on any maps?" The research group left the care home that day with more questions than answers. Elsie's testimony was compelling. She was sharp and articulate, with no signs of dementia or confusion about other aspects of her life. She could describe Middlesham's geography with perfect accuracy, could recall street names and landmarks and how the city had changed over her 9 decades. But she remembered a street that had never existed, or had existed and somehow been erased not just from the physical landscape but from historical records as well. The psychological question was inevitable. Could this be a case of mass false memory? Psychologists have documented numerous instances of false memories, both individual and collective. People can remember events that never happened, can create detailed memories from suggestions or leading questions, can confuse dreams with reality or conflate details from different experiences into a single false memory. The research group consulted with Dr. Alice Pemberton, coincidentally sharing a surname with the remembered bookshop owner, a psychologist at the University of Manchester who specialized in memory research. Dr. Pemberton was intrigued by the case and agreed to study it. She conducted extensive interviews with members of the research group and others who remembered Hartley Street, administering various memory tests and psychological assessments. Her findings were published in 2005 in the Journal of Anomalous Psychology, in a paper titled The Hartley Street Phenomenon, a case study in collective memory discordance. Dr. Pemberton's conclusion was cautious but striking. The individuals she tested showed no signs of confabulation or false memory creation. Their memories of Hartley Street showed all the characteristics of genuine episodic memories: rich sensory details, emotional content, integration with other autobiographical memories. When asked about other aspects of their childhood or their knowledge of Middlesham, they were accurate and consistent with documented history. It was only Hartley Street itself that didn't match the historical record. Dr. Pemberton couldn't explain the phenomenon, but she noted several interesting patterns. First, the consistency of the memories across individuals who had no connection to each other and who ranged widely in age was remarkable. While details varied slightly, some people remembered more shops, others fewer. Some recalled the street as busier, others as quieter. The core description remained constant: the cobblestone paving, the bookshop with the green door, the tea room, the particular quality of light, the sense of peace and timelessness the street evoked. Second, the memories were emotionally neutral or positive. None of the people interviewed reported traumatic experiences on Hartley Street. It was remembered as a pleasant place, perhaps idealized, perhaps remembered with the nostalgia that often colors childhood recollections, but without the emotional intensity that sometimes drives false memory creation. There seemed to be no psychological motivation for creating these memories. Third, and perhaps most puzzling, when Dr. Pemberton asked subjects to describe how they had first arrived at Hartley Street, to trace their route through the city, they could do so clearly, up to a point. They could describe walking through familiar streets, turning corners, passing landmarks. But at the moment of actually entering Hartley Street, there was often a kind of blank spot in the memory, or a sense of transition that was hard to describe. It was like stepping through a doorway, one person said, like the street was somewhere else, somewhere separate, and you had to cross over to get there. This description appeared in multiple interviews, unprompted. The sense that Hartley Street existed in some way apart from the rest of Middlesham, that you didn't just walk to it but somehow transitioned into it. Dr. Pemberton found this fascinating and unsettling. It suggested, though she was careful not to make too strong a claim, that whatever Hartley Street was, it might not have been a normal street in normal space. The research and publicity generated by the research group and Dr. Pemberton's study attracted more people who remembered Hartley Street. By 2006, more than 200 individuals had come forward, all describing the same street, all unable to find it, all troubled by the discordance between their clear memories and the lack of any corroborating evidence. The demographics of these rememberers were telling. They were overwhelmingly people who had lived in or frequently visited Middlesham, which made sense if they were remembering a real place. But they ranged in age from their 20s to their 90s, which meant their memories supposedly spanned nearly 8 decades. Could a street have existed from the 1940s through the 2000s without appearing on a single map, without being mentioned in a single document, without anyone photographing it? Some members of the research group became convinced that there must have been a deliberate cover-up, that Hartley Street had existed and had been systematically erased from records for some reason. Perhaps something terrible had happened there. A disaster, a crime, something that the authorities wanted forgotten. Perhaps the street had been demolished as part of some secret project, and records had been altered to hide the fact that it had ever existed. This conspiracy theory was investigated enthusiastically by some, but it ran into insurmountable problems. Erasing a street from physical existence is easy enough. Demolition crews can do that in weeks. But erasing it from all records, all maps, all photographs, all documentary evidence, while also ensuring that hundreds of people retained clear memories of it, that would require a conspiracy of impossible scope and coordination. And to what end? What could possibly motivate such an effort? Others in the group took different approaches. Some explored paranormal explanations. Perhaps Hartley Street existed in another dimension or parallel reality, and people were somehow accessing memories from that other place. Perhaps it was a ghost street, an echo of a place that had existed in some other time or possibility. Perhaps it was a collective vision or shared hallucination, something generated by the landscape itself or by some unknown property of that particular location in Middlesham. These theories were speculative and impossible to test, but they had the virtue of attempting to explain the otherwise inexplicable. If Hartley Street had never existed in our normal physical reality, perhaps it had existed in some other mode of being, and people's memories reflected a genuine experience of that other mode. A researcher named Martin Webb became particularly interested in the possibility of temporal anomalies. Webb had a background in physics, though he'd never worked academically in the field, and he developed an elaborate theory involving closed time-like curves and quantum superposition. His idea, stripped of its mathematical complexity, was that Hartley Street might exist in a kind of temporal loop or bubble, appearing and disappearing from normal spacetime, accessible only during certain periods or under certain conditions. People's memories of the street would be genuine memories of genuine visits, but the street itself would not have had continuous existence in our timeline. Webb's theory was creative but unprovable, and most scientists who reviewed it found it more poetic than plausible. Still, it represented a sincere attempt to reconcile the undeniable fact of people's memories with the equally undeniable fact that the street didn't exist in any conventional sense. Meanwhile, more personal stories continued to emerge. Each new account added texture to the collective memory of Hartley Street, building a picture of a place that had meant something to many people, even if that place couldn't be found. A man named Thomas Brightwell, in his 50s, remembered proposing to his wife on Hartley Street in 1982. They'd been dating for 2 years, and he'd planned the proposal carefully, choosing the spot near the old oak tree in the small park at the end of the street. He remembered going down on one knee on the grass, remembered the surprised delight on her face, remembered passers-by smiling at them. He remembered walking to Mrs. Aldridge's tea room afterward to celebrate with champagne, or perhaps it was sparkling wine. Mrs. Aldridge wouldn't have had a liquor license. His wife, when asked about this memory, confirmed it. Yes, that was where he'd proposed, on Hartley Street by the oak tree. But when they tried to return to that spot for their 20th anniversary in 2002, they couldn't find it. They'd walked all over central Middlesham, looking for something familiar, and found nothing. A woman named Jennifer Hayes remembered getting her first job on Hartley Street, working in the greengrocer's shop after school, when she was 15, in 1979. She remembered the owner, Mr. Fletcher, teaching her how to arrange the produce to look appealing, how to tell when fruit was perfectly ripe, how to handle the old brass cash register. She remembered the smell of earth and green things, remembered the wooden crates and the sawdust on the floor. She remembered her first wage packet, £3.50, which had seemed like a fortune. She could remember specific customers, their preferences and peculiarities. But there was no record of her employment at such a shop, nothing in her national insurance records, and Mr. Fletcher, if he'd existed, couldn't be found in any city directory. These stories were deeply personal, woven into people's sense of their own histories. Hartley Street wasn't some vague memory or half-forgotten dream. It was the setting for significant life events, first jobs and proposals and childhood adventures. The impossibility of the street's existence threatened the integrity of these memories, made people question their own minds and histories. Some rememberers became distressed by this. If they were wrong about Hartley Street, if they had somehow created detailed false memories of a place that never existed, what did that say about their other memories? Could they trust anything they remembered? A few sought therapy, troubled by the uncertainty and by the implications for their sense of self. Dr. Pemberton, still following the case, noted that this distress was itself evidence for the genuineness of the memories. People with deliberately false memories or fantasies typically don't show this kind of existential disturbance when their memories are challenged. The rememberers of Hartley Street were experiencing the dissonance of having their lived experience contradicted by objective reality, and that dissonance was causing real psychological pain. By 2008, the Hartley Street phenomenon had attracted international attention. Researchers in psychology, folklore, urban studies, and even physics had published papers examining various aspects of the case. Documentary filmmakers had produced several programs about it. Online forums dedicated to discussing Hartley Street had emerged, attracting not just rememberers but also skeptics, debunkers, and theorists of all stripes. One documentary, The Street That Vanished, aired on BBC4 in 2009 and reached a broad audience. It presented the Hartley Street story sympathetically but skeptically, interviewing rememberers, showing their obvious sincerity and conviction, but also consulting with psychologists about false memory and with urban historians about Middlesham's documented history. The documentary didn't offer conclusions, but it presented the mystery compellingly. The broadcast led to a new wave of people coming forward with memories of Hartley Street. Some of these were clearly influenced by having seen the documentary. Their descriptions matched too perfectly, lacked the idiosyncratic details that characterized earlier accounts. But others seemed genuine, people who had carried private memories of the street for years and were relieved to discover they weren't alone. Among this new wave was a particularly intriguing account from a man named Richard Aldrich, who claimed to be the grandson of Mrs. Aldrich who had run the tea room on Hartley Street. Richard was in his 40s and had grown up in Middlesham, though he'd moved away for work in the 1990s. He remembered visiting his grandmother's tea room as a child in the 1970s, remembered the lace curtains and round tables that others had described, remembered his grandmother's kindness and the smell of baking that always filled the shop. What made Richard's account particularly interesting was that he had specific genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, documenting his family history. His grandmother had indeed been named Dorothy Aldrich, and she had indeed lived in Middlesham during the relevant period. According to Richard, she had run a tea room from the 1950s until her death in 1989. He remembered attending her funeral, remembered the small gathering of regular customers who came to pay their respects. But here was the problem. Richard could produce no documentation of the tea room itself. No business licenses, no tax records, no advertisements, nothing. His grandmother appeared in census records and other official documents, but her occupation was listed as housewife, not business owner. There were no commercial listings for any tea room run by a Dorothy Aldrich in Middlesham. When questioned, Richard became defensive. He knew his grandmother had run that tea room. He had been there, had helped her sometimes, washing dishes in the back, sweeping the floor after closing. How could he have these memories if they weren't real? How could he remember specific events? His 10th birthday party held in the tea room, with his friends from school and his grandmother's special cake, if it never happened. The research group investigated Richard's claims carefully. They found his grandmother's grave in Middlesham Cemetery. The headstone read, Dorothy Aldrich, 1921 to 1989, beloved wife and grandmother. No mention of the tea room, but that wasn't unusual. They found neighbors who remembered Dorothy Aldrich, described her as a kind woman, a good neighbor. But when asked if she'd run a tea room, they looked puzzled. No, they said, she'd been a housewife, her husband had worked in the factories, they'd been ordinary working-class people. Richard insisted they were wrong or misremembering, or had known his grandmother only later in life. But the weight of evidence suggested that Dorothy Aldrich, while a real person, had never run a tea room. Yet Richard's memories were vivid and specific. Either he was deliberately lying, and there seemed no motive for such a lie, or he genuinely remembered something that never happened. This pattern repeated with other claims that emerged. People would come forward with seemingly corroborating evidence, but when investigated, the evidence would dissolve or prove ambiguous. Someone would claim to have a photograph showing a building on Hartley Street, but the photograph, when examined, would turn out to show a different street entirely, or would be too unclear to identify definitively. Someone would produce a document, a receipt, a letter, a diary entry, that mentioned Hartley Street, but the mention would be vague or could be interpreted differently. It was as if Hartley Street existed in a realm just beyond proof, always almost verified but never quite confirmed. The sheer number of people who remembered it made dismissing their testimony difficult, but the complete absence of physical evidence made accepting it equally difficult. The phenomenon existed in a frustrating middle ground between the clearly real and the obviously imaginary. The research group, now more than a decade into their investigation, began to fracture. Some members remained convinced that Hartley Street had physically existed and had somehow been erased, and they continued searching for documentary evidence of the erasure. Others moved toward accepting that the street might never have existed physically but represented something else. A shared cultural memory, perhaps, or a psychological phenomenon that created similar experiences in many people. Still others simply gave up, exhausted by years of searching with nothing conclusive to show for their efforts. Margaret Fenton, who had been one of the original discoverers of the phenomenon, published a memoir in 2012 titled Searching for Hartley Street, a personal journey through memory and mystery. In it, she reflected on what the long investigation had meant to her, how it had changed her understanding of memory, place, and certainty. She wrote movingly about the frustration of having such clear memories contradicted by reality, but also about the unexpected gift of community that had emerged from the search, the friendships formed with fellow rememberers, the shared sense of purpose, the comfort of knowing others experienced the same bewildering certainty about a place that couldn't be found. Margaret's memoir included a chapter on what she called the emotional geography of Hartley Street, the way people's memories of the street were bound up with feelings of safety, nostalgia, and a certain kind of peace. Nearly everyone who remembered Hartley Street described it as a refuge, a place where time moved differently, where the pressures of normal life seemed distant. Several people used almost identical language. When I was on Hartley Street, I felt like everything was going to be all right. This emotional dimension suggested something interesting. Perhaps Hartley Street wasn't so much a physical place as a psychological one, a mental space that many people in Middlesham had constructed as a kind of retreat from stress and difficulty. Perhaps the consistency of the details, the cobblestones, the bookshop, the tea room, reflected not shared experience of a real place but shared cultural symbols of comfort and safety, images drawn from a collective idea of what a perfect, peaceful street would be like. Dr. Pemberton, still following the case with interest, found this interpretation plausible but incomplete. Yes, the memories had emotional resonance and symbolic meaning, but that didn't explain their specificity or the conviction with which people held them. False memories created for psychological comfort typically have a dreamlike quality, a sense of being too perfect or idealized. The memories of Hartley Street, while pleasant, had the texture of real experience. The imperfect details, the mundane moments, the ordinary interactions that characterize actual life rather than fantasy. In 2013, a technological approach was attempted. A computer graphics team at a London university worked with members of the research group to create a virtual reality reconstruction of Hartley Street based on the collective memories. Over several months, they conducted detailed interviews with dozens of rememberers, asking precise questions about measurements, colors, materials, architectural details, the arrangement of shops and buildings. The resulting virtual environment was remarkably coherent. Despite minor variations in different people's memories, there was enough agreement on the essential features to build a convincing three-dimensional model. You could put on a VR headset and walk down virtual Hartley Street, see the bookshop with its green door, peer through the windows of the tea room, examine the cobblestones and the Victorian lampposts, stand under the oak tree in the small park. When rememberers experienced this virtual reconstruction, their reactions were intense and often emotional. "That's it," they would say. "That's exactly right." They would point out details, the specific curve of the street, the height of the buildings, the particular shade of green on the bookshop door, confirming that the reconstruction matched their memories. Several people broke down crying, overwhelmed by seeing a place they remembered vividly but had been unable to return to. But of course, this didn't prove anything about whether Hartley Street had ever physically existed. All it proved was that many people shared similar mental images and memories. The virtual reconstruction was created from those memories, so its coherence simply reflected the consistency of the memories themselves, not the reality of the place they supposedly depicted. Still, the VR project had value beyond attempting to prove or disprove the street's existence. It gave rememberers a way to revisit the place they missed, a kind of memorial to something that might or might not have been real. The VR files were made publicly available, and people from around the world downloaded them, walking through virtual Hartley Street, experiencing the place that hundreds of people in Middlesham remembered but could not find. Some of these virtual visitors reported strange experiences. They described feeling unexpectedly emotional while exploring the virtual street, even though they had no personal memories of such a place. They described a sense of familiarity, of recognition, as if they too remembered Hartley Street even though they'd never been to Middlesham, had no connection to the city or the phenomenon. A few even claimed that, after experiencing the VR reconstruction, they realized they had memories of Hartley Street, memories that had been buried or forgotten but that the virtual experience brought to the surface. These reports were troubling to researchers. Were they evidence that Hartley Street represented something universal, some archetypal space that resonated with human psychology regardless of personal experience? Or were they simply cases of suggestion, people creating false memories based on the detailed virtual environment they'd experienced? The inability to definitively answer this question was characteristic of the entire Hartley Street phenomenon. Every finding could be interpreted multiple ways. Every piece of evidence proved ambiguous. By 2015, academic interest in Hartley Street had evolved into a broader discussion about the nature of collective memory, the reliability of eyewitness testimony, and the way places exist in human consciousness. The phenomenon was cited in papers on false memory, urban folklore, the psychology of nostalgia, the phenomenology of place, and even quantum mechanics. It had become a kind of test case, an example that could be used to support various theoretical positions. But for the rememberers themselves, the academic discussions often felt beside the point. They didn't need theories about collective false memory or quantum superposition. They simply wanted to find the street they remembered, or to understand why they couldn't. The mystery remained personal and painful, a source of ongoing frustration and occasional distress. Some rememberers developed coping strategies. They accepted that they would never find physical Hartley Street again, but they cultivated their memories, wrote down everything they could recall, drew pictures, created detailed maps based on their recollections. They treated their memories as valuable in themselves, regardless of whether they corresponded to a place that had physically existed. Others couldn't let go of the search. They continued to explore Middlesham, walking through the city's streets with maps and notebooks, hoping to stumble upon some overlooked alley or forgotten corner that would prove to be Hartley Street, hidden in plain sight all along. They developed elaborate theories about temporal anomalies, parallel dimensions, government conspiracies, mass hypnosis, anything that might explain the inexplicable discordance between memory and reality. One such searcher, a man named Peter Whitmore, devoted nearly 20 years to investigating Hartley Street. He retired early from his job as an accountant and dedicated himself full-time to the search, spending his days in archives and his evenings walking through Middlesham streets. His house became a repository of documents, maps, photographs, and notes, all related to Hartley Street or to Middlesham's history more generally. Whitmore's obsession was both impressive and concerning. He had assembled an extraordinary collection of historical material about Middlesham, had interviewed hundreds of people, had traced architectural changes and urban development through nearly 2 centuries. If Hartley Street had existed and been deliberately erased from records, Whitmore would have found the evidence. But he never did. Every promising lead evaporated upon investigation. Every potential piece of corroborating evidence proved to be something else when examined closely. In 2018, Whitmore gave a presentation to the research group, which still met monthly, though with dwindling attendance as members aged or moved away or simply tired of the endless inconclusive investigation. Whitmore's presentation was exhaustive, running nearly 4 hours, detailing every aspect of his research. His conclusion was both definitive and devastating. Hartley Street never existed. Not in our timeline, not in our reality, not in any documented history of Middlesham. The evidence for this is overwhelming and unambiguous. And yet, I remember it. I remember it as clearly as I remember my own childhood, my own life. I remember working there, visiting there, living parts of my life there. These memories are real to me, even though the place they describe is not. The room was silent after Whitmore finished. He had articulated what many in the group had come to suspect but had been reluctant to fully accept. The street they remembered had never existed. Their memories, however vivid and detailed and emotionally resonant, did not correspond to physical reality. They would never find Hartley Street because there was no Hartley Street to find. But this conclusion, while intellectually satisfying in its definitiveness, didn't resolve the deeper mystery. If Hartley Street had never existed, where did these memories come from? How had so many people independently developed such similar recollections of a place that wasn't real? What did it mean that their minds had constructed or accessed memories of experiences that never happened? Dr. Pemberton, attending Whitmore's presentation, offered one possible framework for thinking about this. She suggested that perhaps the category of real and not real was too binary to capture what was happening with Hartley Street. Perhaps there were modes of existence that didn't fit neatly into either category. Perhaps Hartley Street existed in some sense, in memory, in imagination, in some kind of collective psychological space without existing physically. And perhaps that mode of existence was no less valid or meaningful than physical existence, just different. This philosophical approach appealed to some group members. It allowed them to honor their memories without requiring those memories to correspond to historical fact. It suggested that Hartley Street was real in the ways that mattered, in its impact on people's lives, in the comfort and meaning it provided, in the community it had created among those who remembered it. Others found this too abstract, too much like giving up on the search for truth. They wanted concrete answers, wanted to know definitely whether Hartley Street had existed or not, and if it had, what had happened to it. The idea that it might exist in some nebulous psychological or philosophical sense without having physical reality felt like a consolation prize, an attempt to make meaning out of what was essentially a failure to explain the phenomenon. The research group's meetings became increasingly philosophical and reflective, less focused on active investigation than on discussing what the phenomenon meant, how to live with irresolvable uncertainty, how to value memories that couldn't be verified. Some members stopped attending, finding these discussions frustrating or pointless. Others found them deeply meaningful, a way to process the strange experience they'd been through. In 2019, Margaret Fenton died at age 84. Her obituary in the Middlesham Chronicle mentioned her role in discovering the Hartley Street phenomenon and founding the research group. The funeral was well attended, including many members of the group and others who had been touched by the mystery. During the service, several people spoke about how Margaret's openness about her memories had given them permission to acknowledge their own, how the community she'd helped create had made them feel less alone and less uncertain about their own minds. After the service, a group of rememberers gathered at a pub near the city center and shared stories about Hartley Street, reminiscing about a place most of them had never visited together, that perhaps had never existed at all. The conversation had a valedictory quality, a sense that an era was ending. The original investigators were aging, and younger people seemed less interested in the mystery. The Hartley Street phenomenon, which had once seemed urgent and important, was fading into local folklore, a curious story about mass delusion or collective false memory, or maybe something stranger that had happened in Middlesham in the early 2000s. But even as the organized investigation wound down, the mystery persisted. People continued to remember Hartley Street, continued to describe it to friends and family, continued to experience that peculiar frustration of remembering something vividly that couldn't be found. And occasionally, new reports would surface. Someone would post on social media about remembering a street in Middlesham that they couldn't locate, and others would respond with recognition, and the conversation would unfold again, the same descriptions emerging, the same details repeated. In 2021, a journalist named Claire Matthews published a long-form piece about Hartley Street in The Guardian, bringing the story to a national audience once again. Matthews had grown up in Middlesham and had her own memories of Hartley Street from childhood visits in the 1990s. Her article was personal and investigative, examining her own memories while also documenting the broader phenomenon and the various attempts to explain it. Matthews's article generated significant response. Hundreds of people commented online, many of them describing their own memories of streets or places they couldn't find, experiences similar to Hartley Street, but in different cities. There was a street in Bristol that some people remembered but couldn't locate, a square in Edinburgh that had similar qualities, a marketplace in Liverpool that appeared in multiple people's memories but not on any map. This suggested that Hartley Street might not be unique, that it might represent a broader phenomenon of phantom places, locations that exist in memory but not in documented geography. Some researchers began to explore this possibility, collecting accounts from different cities, looking for patterns and commonalities. What emerged from this broader investigation was intriguing. The phantom places that people described often shared certain qualities. They were remembered as peaceful, separated from the bustle and stress of modern life. They often featured old-fashioned architecture and commerce, independent bookshops, tea rooms, specialist shops that had largely disappeared from actual high streets. They were places where time seemed to move differently, where people felt safe and unhurried. This suggested that the phantom places might represent a kind of collective nostalgia, a shared longing for a slower, simpler, more humane urban environment than most modern cities provide. Perhaps they were mental constructions, places that many people independently imagined based on similar desires and cultural influences, and that some people then developed into detailed memories, either through misremembering actual places or through some process of unconscious creative memory construction. This explanation had psychological and sociological plausibility, but it still didn't quite fit the specific character of the Hartley Street memories. Yes, there was nostalgia in these recollections, but there was also mundanity, the everyday details that don't typically feature in idealized fantasies. People remembered not just the pleasant aspects of Hartley Street, but also the ordinary and sometimes unpleasant ones. The uneven cobblestones that were hard to walk on, the drafty tea room on cold days, the occasionally grumpy shopkeepers, the smell of car exhaust from nearby streets. By 2023, nearly 20 years after the phenomenon first came to widespread attention, Hartley Street had become a permanent part of Middlesham's identity and folklore. Tour guides mentioned it when showing visitors around the city. The local museum had a small exhibit about it, displaying copies of maps and documents and photographs from the research group's investigation. The VR reconstruction was available at the museum, allowing visitors to experience virtual Hartley Street for themselves. The mystery had never been solved. Despite decades of investigation by researchers from multiple disciplines, despite extensive documentation of people's memories, despite careful examination of every possible piece of evidence, no definitive answer had emerged about what Hartley Street was or where the memories of it came from. The phenomenon remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, a profound mystery, a challenge to assumptions about memory and reality, a reminder that human experience sometimes resists categorization and explanation. For those who remembered Hartley Street, the lack of resolution was something they'd learned to live with. They carried their memories, shared them with others who understood, and accepted that they would never walk down that cobblestone street again, would never push open the green door of the bookshop or sit at the round tables in the tea room. The street existed for them in memory and imagination, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was its true mode of existence all along. Some philosophical perspectives suggested that this might be precisely the point. Perhaps Hartley Street existed to teach something about the nature of memory and place, about how locations live in human consciousness independent of their physical existence, about how the geography of the mind is as real and as important as the geography of streets and buildings. Perhaps the inability to find Hartley Street was itself meaningful, a lesson in accepting uncertainty and mystery, in living with questions that have no answers. Others found such philosophical consolations unsatisfying. They wanted concrete answers, wanted to know whether they were remembering something real or had somehow constructed detailed false memories. The ambiguity was maddening, the inability to ever know for certain whether their experience was veridical or illusory. But perhaps the real significance of Hartley Street lies not in solving the mystery but in the way the mystery has affected those who encountered it. The search for the vanished street brought people together, created communities of shared experience and mutual support. It challenged assumptions about memory and certainty. It opened questions about the nature of place and belonging. It reminded people that reality might be more complex and strange than everyday experience suggests. The phenomenon also highlighted something about urban life and change. Cities transform constantly, demolishing old buildings and constructing new ones, altering street patterns and neighborhood characters. In the process, places disappear, and sometimes all that remains are memories, individual or collective recollections of what used to be. Usually, these memories can be verified against photographs and maps and documents. But what happens when a remembered place has no such corroboration? Does that make the memory false, or does it suggest that some places exist primarily in memory, that their reality is psychological rather than physical? Hartley Street, whether it ever physically existed or not, clearly exists as an idea, a shared reference point for hundreds of people, a place that has meaning and emotional resonance regardless of its ontological status. In that sense, it's as real as any place needs to be. It has affected people's lives, has been the subject of research and discussion, has created community and connection. Its existence in memory and imagination is perhaps more durable than physical existence would have been. Buildings can be demolished, streets can be renamed, but memories persist, passed down through stories and conversations, living on in human consciousness. As night settles over Middlesham in our present day, the space where Hartley Street is remembered but not found remains unchanged. A car park behind the old Woolworths building, functional and unremarkable. But in the memories of those who claim to have been there, another street overlays this mundane reality. A street of cobblestones and Victorian lamp posts, of bookshops and tea rooms, of oak trees and quiet afternoons. A street that everyone remembers but no one can find. The phenomenon continues. New people occasionally come forward with memories of Hartley Street. The online forums remain active, if less frequented than in earlier years. The research group still meets, though only a handful of the original members remain. The mystery persists, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a reminder that not everything can be explained, that human experience includes elements that resist rational analysis and empirical verification. And maybe that's all right. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. Some questions are meant to stay unanswered. Maybe Hartley Street serves its purpose precisely by being unfindable, by existing in that liminal space between memory and reality, between the documented past and the experienced past, between what we know and what we remember. The street that everyone remembers but no one can find continues to exist in the only way it ever truly existed, in the minds and hearts of those who remember it, in the stories they tell about it, in the community created by shared experience of something that might never have been real but that feels more real than many things that demonstrably are. If you found yourself drawn into this mystery, if you felt the frustration of searching for something that can't be found or the strange comfort of knowing others share your inexplicable memories, please like this video and subscribe to Hushed History. We explore the quiet mysteries, the phenomena that exist at the edges of understanding, the stories that remind us how strange and wonderful and uncertain our world truly is. There are so many more mysteries to discover together, so many more questions to explore even if we never find definitive answers. And perhaps tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you'll find yourself walking down a street you've never seen but somehow recognize. A street of cobblestones and old shops, of peace and timelessness. A street that exists somewhere between memory and dream. And maybe that's where Hartley Street has always been, in that borderland of consciousness where the remembered and the imagined blur together, where places can be vividly real without being physically present, where everyone can visit even though no one can find the way. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and may your memories, whether they correspond to documented reality or not, bring you comfort and connection and a sense of belonging to the strange and beautiful mystery of human consciousness and experience. Until we meet again in another story, another mystery, another journey through the hushed places where certainty gives way to wonder, good night. The street that everyone remembers but no one can find continues to exist in the only way it ever truly existed, in the minds and hearts of those who remember it, in the stories they tell about it, in the community created by shared experience of something that might never have been real but that feels more real than many things that demonstrably are. If you found yourself drawn into this mystery, if you felt the frustration of searching for something that can't be found or the strange comfort of knowing others share your inexplicable memories, please like this video and subscribe to Hushed History.